Hello and welcome to Of Significance, the podcast where analysis isn't auto-generated, but it seems like it should be. I'm your every person host, Brent right here with Dr. Nathan Woods and Dr. Steve Broners, experienced experts who've been analyzing big data since before it was big. If you don't like their jokes, they'll iterate until you find them acceptable. All right, today, AI is everywhere and algorithms are inescapable, but the application of AI is creating new and, unsurprisingly, complicated problems when it comes to thinking about antitrust cases related to pricing. So today we brought in antitrust whiz kid Mike Kheyfets to discuss the real world issues AI introduces, how we can think about class certification in light of it, and where its use might be heading. Mike, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So to start out, can you talk to us very briefly about what are the related issues to a price fixing case and how AI has become tied to how companies price goods?
Sure. And if you just sort of think, at a high level about prices, anybody that's selling something has to figure out how to price their product, whether that's legal services or sandwiches or widgets. You have to figure out who your market is, what the supply and demand factors are, and sort of translate all that information into what are you going to charge your customers. And the algorithmic piece of it is essentially companies trying to use computer programs, algorithms, AI techniques to essentially do that, to gather information, to try to translate information into the price setting process. So whereas, maybe back in the day, as some of us remember, the way prices used to be set, you sort of have people looking at information manually and making those decisions manually. But as technology has evolved, it's become more computerized, more automated. And so, it's just a lot of the things we buy now are potentially priced using algorithms.
So how does a company actually use an algorithm to set their prices? Is it something where they've got something proprietary within their own company, or are they hiring out third parties? Where does the system come from?
And there's lots of different models, right? So there are in-house algorithms, and anybody can write a piece of code that goes out and collects information and process that information. There's kind of a silly example from years ago. About 15 years ago, there was a story about two sellers on Amazon. Each wrote a piece of code that would go out and look at what the other is selling books for. And essentially they got into this vortex of each one of the two was looking at the other's price and just multiplying that by a number. And that was the algorithm. And the end result was they kind of were looking back and forth and multiplying by numbers. And they ended up selling some esoteric textbook for $24 million.
Well, it's not clear they sold any of them.
They were offering it. They were offering it for sale. I don't know if any were sold.
Yeah, so that they didn't create economic value with that.
But that's that's kind of like a silly, simple algorithm that each of them developed independently to try to, again, ingest some information about what to charge for their product and then set the price that way. But there's obviously way more advanced, way more complicated, sophisticated things that companies are doing now. It's not just taking your competitor's price and multiplying that by some number. It's in real time collecting information, processing it using sophisticated techniques. And to your question, whether it's done in-house or whether there are third-party services, that's kind of where the antitrust issues start to come in. Certainly companies have in-house algorithms that they use, but where some concerns have been raised around these issues is where there's actually a third-party provider, a firm who's in the business of developing the algorithm, and that's the product they sell. And so the competition concerns are around, is that something that could potentially facilitate collusion?
So that's interesting. Just on that point, so theoretically, if I'm doing it in-house and I write my own code, hopefully a little bit better than the $25 million book on Amazon, but whatever that piece, I'm doing it myself. That there's no issue there. I can go out and get the data. It's just basically like a more efficient, maybe, way of doing what we have always done, collecting information on our the prices of our competitors. And that's okay.
Well, I'm wary of giving legal advice on the podcast. I know you guys like to straddle that line, but I think at least where we've seen concerns raised, whether it's by private plaintiffs, whether it's by the competition authorities, the concerns have been more generally raised on these third-party algorithms. So, lots of companies, again, in lots of different industries for lots of different products, use algorithms, and it hasn't been the case that using your own algorithm has been raised as much of a concern as the third party, the outside vendors that are selling this as a service to their customers.
So Mike, it seems to me like the algorithm is just a more efficient way of taking that information that may be the same information that people would have used before, assuming that you're doing it yourself. So it's not really the algorithm. Is it more the inputs to the algorithm that is the issue, or is there something about the way in which the price recommendations come out of the algorithm that are also an issue there?
And I think that's where where these cases are, the legal cases are kind of in their infancy, and we're yet to see exactly where that line is between what's collusive versus what's just using an algorithm to be more efficient. Where the crux of these cases are right now, at least, is not so much about the inputs. Well, really, it's, are you potentially having access to your competitor's proprietary information, right? So what I think we've seen to be the case is that there's not a competition issue if you go out and you just see what your competitor posts publicly. That's public information. There's not been an issue in terms of using that as an input into your pricing methodology. It's really when you start to have an information sharing element where competitors are potentially sharing sensitive information that's not public. If you sort of think of the old school conspiracy where people will get together in a smoke-filled room and exchange sensitive information that they shouldn't be exchanging, that was sort of the classical cartel issue. And so, to your point, Steve, it's less about the specific processing maybe that the algorithm is doing, and more about, is there an element of the algorithm has access to information that the competitor wouldn't have otherwise if they didn't sign up for the algorithm.
Why did they fill the room with smoke? Do they have to do that, or?
Yeah, I think that's just how business was done back in those days.
Yeah.
Spittoons also.
I'm a little bit surprised that using your competitor's prices in an algorithm in-house itself wouldn't be considered collusion in some way, because I could easily envision two companies like and Lyft, where they're setting some kind of dynamic pricing model. They're looking at each other's prices, and they've got an algorithmic rule that basically says try and drive the price slightly lower than your competitor. And so you end up at an equilibrium where both of them are, I guess they're setting a lower price than the one expected for the
That would be a book about flies that was free then, because if you just go, I'm going to keep undercutting you, right? And if you don't do anything other than follow the algorithm, it's either going to get infinite or to zero, right? If I keep raising the price or lowering the price. So presumably in these situations, they're like, okay, that tells me one thing, but my costs are this. I'm not going to sell it for whatever.
Yeah, and that's what some of the these cases again are ongoing. Some of these courts are saying in these cases, it's not, if your competitor posts something publicly, then it's in a public domain essentially, and that's information that it's not anti-competitive to use that in your price setting process. It's only when the information is not public, you're sort of sharing sensitive information that you as a firm have no incentive to share with others other than to further a conspiracy or a cartel.
So it's not just that it's more efficient. You have access to information you would not have otherwise through that third-party vendor is the allegation.
Exactly. And the concern being sort of the reverse, Brenda, what you were describing, which is not that you would drive prices down to zero because nobody wants that book about flies. It's that by knowing your competitor's sensitive information, you can actually resist driving prices down again, potentially, this is sort of a theoretical concern that is being worked out in these cases. But by knowing what your competitor's doing, might you be able to resist essentially competing and undercutting each other? And might you be able to preserve prices at a level higher than they would otherwise be?
But Mike, I think what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that because a lot of sellers of goods and services, you can go online and see what their prices are. It would have to be more than that the algorithm was using, right? Because that's just like, well, that's public information.
Right. That's why the competition concerns have been mostly around not just the more simple algorithms that just pull information, off the internet, for example, but it's the proprietary software where different competitors feed their proprietary information in. And even if they don't directly get to observe, well, my competitor is charging X, the fact that the data is commingled within the algorithm is the potential concern. That even if Nathan and I and Brent and Steve don't see each other's sensitive data, the fact that it all exists within the algorithm and each of us is getting a recommendation for how to price our product based on that, there's concern that potentially that could result in some collusive behavior.
Mike, could you give us an example, if you have one, of the kind of information that would be this proprietary information that would potentially raise a red flag if it was used in one of these algorithms?
And I think potentially is the important term there, because there's not a comprehensive list, for example, of things that can be shared and things that can't be shared. But for example, if there's certain types of information that a firm doesn't publish in the public domain, presumably it has a reason for not doing that. And so anything that is shared with the algorithm that isn't just available through public filings or just posted somewhere, that has the potential to raise concerns. But the sorts of things Steve, you were talking about, whether it's capacity information, whether it's sort of strategic reasoning behind why a firm does something, cost structure, any number of details about the business that the business wouldn't have an incentive to share with its competitors other than participation in a cartel. And again, these are the sorts of theories that are being offered, but we're not yet at a place where we can definitively say, like anything that's in this bucket is problematic. Anything in the other bucket is okay.
Yeah, I think a little bit about in the world of labor and employment, where I spend a lot of my time, these, external benchmarking kinds of data sources where you can salary surveys and you promise to give them your information. It's anonymized, it's banded, it's not too precise probably. And then it gets in there with everybody else's, and then you get the report back, and then that helps you guide your salary decisions, make sure you're competitive in the marketplace. And I guess what I wonder, I know it's a little bit of a different thing, but that seems like very similar, except for maybe not the strategic background on, for planning on opening up a new office in some new city or something like that. But that information seems like it is commingled with lots of other people, and we make decisions on the basis that affect salary decisions and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's a similar use case, and frankly, the algorithms, the value proposition that these companies are offering their users is, we have a wealth of information about the marketplace, and we can help you sort of unilaterally improve your decision making, whether it's how to pay your employees or how to price your product. That's sort of the offering that these types of things have. And so, again, not to say that in every single instance where there's information sharing that's problematic, but just kind of looking at the landscape of these cases, we look at the private class actions. The Department of Justice has filed, cases that use the terminology algorithmic collusion. Like the potential for sharing sensitive information is where the concern has been. But exactly where that line is, that's something we'll find out eventually.
It seems like, Mike, that there are potential gains from efficiency and making sure that resources are being utilized if you have better pricing decisions, that use this information. So in these kind of cases that you're talking about, is that one of the arguments in favor of using these algorithms?
Yeah, I mean, that's where a lot of the value proposition comes from, right? Something like airline tickets, hotel rooms, something that's very dynamic, something where conditions can change quickly, and there are gains to be had from acting on the most current information, and also gains to be had from acting quickly. That's where the efficiency gains that you're talking about could happen, right? It's if something happens abruptly and you've been able to get that information into your model and act on it, that could be beneficial to you as a business. If you don't get that information in and you don't act on it, that could be less beneficial. So, the efficiency, sort of the ability to respond to new information quickly, the ability to be systematic, right? Some of the things you see in the literature about this is it kind of tries to take the human error element out of pricing and sort of misread market signals. That's at least, again, that's when you see pricing algorithms described in the literature, that's sort of the pro-competitive value that are described.
So I'm curious, you mentioned some of the cases that have tried to deal with this. How far along did they get? Why were they stopped at the stage they were stopped at?
Yeah, so there are a couple, and I mentioned hotels earlier. That's a sort of product that's very dynamically priced. Things can change quickly. There were a couple of cases. One had to do with hotels in Atlantic City, Brent, which I know is a favorite of yours.
Yes.
Destination.
And all the bachelorette parties I go to.
Yeah.
And then the other one was in Vegas. I know you go there as well.
So. I'm less of a Vegas fan, but
okay.
Wow.
You gamble where you can.
Yeah.
That seems like too much of a coincidence, doesn't it?
What, that I don't like Vegas?
No, that the two places were Atlantic City and Vegas.
I mean, I imagine there's lots of hotels around there, right?
Yeah, there are.
I don't think you're imagining. I think from having been there many times, I think that you know that there
are. Okay, I do. Maybe I know a thing or two.
So the issues have essentially, in those two cases, have been the operators of the hotels were using this kind of third-party software to essentially recommend how to price their hotel rooms. And both of those cases were dismissed essentially for a number of reasons, but one of the main reasons was that there actually wasn't a commingling of the sensitive information. So even though each competitor was feeding their own data into the system, what the system was producing for them wasn't actually relying on their competitors' information. And so that was part of the reason that the courts in those cases dismissed the claim, saying essentially it doesn't rise to the level of an agreement to fix prices if you're not actually exchanging that sensitive information. Now, those decisions are being appealed, so I don't think the final word is out on exactly what's going to happen, but that's at least where we've seen courts start to draw the line. Is there commingling of competitors' sensitive information or not? And at least at the motion to dismiss stage, that's where at least some courts have been drawn the line.
That's a market. I know from the William Shatner Priceline commercials back in the day and that annoying guy for Trivago. And just, there are a ton of websites out there where they have all the information. So it seems like, you're providing a service there with this algorithm, but it's not like it's a huge mystery what the hotel rates are. Right, Mike? So it's like you're putting the information together, but it couldn't be in that situation.
Well, the rates,
it's a surprise what the rates are.
Those are the outputs, though, right? Those are the outputs, right? So if you don't, for example, know vacancy rates or other sorts of things that are happening at the hotel that are causing those rates to be the result of the algorithmic process. So they can observe, right? One hotel can go to Trivago or one of these other websites, and they can observe what others are posting, but they don't get to observe vacancy.
How many of the rooms were vacant on a particular day, or where they are, how many more rooms they have left, and things like that. So obviously it'd be that kind of information. The price information, though, is not, the key issue there, because you would know what that is, whether you use the third-party algorithm or not.
And maybe it's a silly question, but why would we expect these prices necessarily to always go up?
So that's the probably more than $1 million question.
Whatever it's triple that.
Yeah, actually make it 4 times that amount.
We call it trebled actually in our line.
We call it treble. Yeah, treble that.
So if you look at the academic literature on algorithmic pricing, which is voluminous, there actually isn't any sort of consensus that algorithmic pricing makes prices go up. They can go down, they can stay unchanged. It's to the extent there's any consensus at all, which there isn't, it's that algorithms help line pricing up more efficiently with the underlying supply and demand conditions. And so it could be that it helps you spot if demand drops, it helps you spot that sooner and it helps you drop your price sooner. Or if it sees demand going up faster than expected, it can sort of spot that trend and help you align your price with that trend. So, this notion that pricing algorithms are just price increasing machines, that's sort of a theory that's being developed in the litigation space. But if you look at the academic literature, if you look at sort of the value proposition that the vendors of these softwares are offering, it's not. They're sort of trying to help you align your pricing with the economic fundamentals, even if potentially that means charging less than you would have charged otherwise. So
I like that answer, Mike. I think isn't it possible that for something where the prices are so dynamic like hotels, some weekends the price would be higher and you'd be less likely to run out of rooms early, and other times the price would be lower. So if you're just having more efficient pricing, it's not even that would always move in the same direction, right? It's just, like you're saying, it's trying to allocate the rooms to the people who value them most, and not be in situations where you have a bunch of rooms that are empty, or you ran out of rooms too early in the whole booking process, right?
Yeah, exactly. And again, just to sort of the competition issue that has been raised in this space, right? It's the concern that essentially hotels or any competitors are going to be able to use algorithms to somehow restrict competition, right? And so that's a little bit different than saying, I'm going to use a computer program, which is all an algorithm is, to ingest some data, crunch it in some particular way that has been programmed to crunch, and then give me a recommendation for how I should price my product. So the concern is sort of on a subset of the universe of pricing algorithm, is that might algorithms sort of find the way to do what would otherwise have been done in a smoke-filled room back in the day, and essentially sort of convince each other to not drop prices.
This is where I think this is so interesting to talk about, because how would what's the, if you're doing damages in a case like this, how would you figure it out? I mean, you got the invisible hand on the one hand and I think it's called the digital hand on the other.
Is it?
Is it?
It is.
Okay.
In the algorithmic collusion
in the community.
Yeah.
research, community. But how would you ever tell the difference? Because unless somebody is in this kind of nefarious way putting something into the algorithm to nudge the thing up, because you've got the smoke-filled room thing going on, fine, but if it really is kind of what's the most efficient way to allocate these rooms at what prices at what time, given a whole bunch of factors, that is just a more efficient thing. That is the invisible hand operating more efficiently than it otherwise would have. So how would you ever even think about how would you do damages? How would you compare it? What's the benchmark? What's the alternative?
Yeah, that's the other $1 million question. We have several $1 million questions on the podcast already. So I think as a practical matter, these cases just haven't yet gotten to that stage. I think we're yet to see one go to trial, even to see sort of expert analysis of damages issues. But when we think about actual and but-for worlds all the time, I think your question is, well, what is the but-for world? What happens if, first of all, which thing is actually illegal or controversial, right? Is it just the use of the algorithm itself? And is the but-for world where you go back to the, Excel spreadsheet that's filled in manually? Is it that certain elements of the algorithm are problematic potentially, where it's the commingling of competitors' data. And so is the but-for world. You can still use the algorithm. You just can't commingle, right? It's defining which element is the concern is a starting point, and then sort of figuring out, well, if we take away that element, what happens to prices then? And kind of an interesting, like this one, Steve, but kind of an interesting wrinkle to all of this too is some of these are based on machine learning, which is a thing that essentially the algorithm itself evolves as it collects more information. And so the algorithm, 3 months from now is actually not the same as it was 3 months ago. And not because it was recoded, but just because it sort of collected more information and evolved. And so that makes the but-for world issue even more complicated, where you have to sort of trace back, well, how did the algorithm evolve over time? And then what would the but-for algorithm have been at any given point in time? And again, we're yet to see that actualized through a damages model by an economist, but those are the sorts of issues you'd want to wrangle with if you were doing damages in a case like that.
Yeah, and it seems like you could make the argument that in order to continue, given the dynamics in this market, in order to continue to be the most efficient pricing, you might need to use machine learning to keep learning about the system. And so just the fact that it's learning, the system is learning, doesn't mean it's, more or less likely to be collusive, right? It could be the use of machine learning just to get more and more efficient over time.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a handful of very theoretical academic papers that have been written where essentially the authors came up with their own algorithms and they sort of coded them up in a way that over time they found ways to collude. And that's a very specific application. Once you've designed an algorithm that's going to try to collude, unsurprisingly, it did that eventually. An algorithm that isn't designed with that
longer than expected.
Yeah,
they needed more smoke.
But once you step into the real world where companies aren't presumably designing cartel machines, right, through algorithms, they're kind of trying to do what you described, Steve, which is price more efficiently. Then you're sort of back to that question. Well, what would have happened, if you take away the commingling of information from different competitors? Does that actually make prices lower? There's not any sort of clear evidence in the literature, for example, that would be the case. It could well be the price would be higher because you now have less information is being sort of fed into the price setting process, and you're further away from the economic fundamentals. So, this is kind of a interesting area in that the conduct that's been challenged as anti-competitive has the potential to actually move prices in either direction.
So the algorithm, you built this cartel-like algorithm, and you tell all of the subscribers, keep the prices high, reduce the quantity. So let's say if it's the hotel room example, there'll be more vacant rooms, and we'll all make more money than we would have if we were competing. Don't you as an individual subscriber say, well, thank you all for charging a higher price. I'm going to charge a slightly lower price, and I'm going to be booked full. And so I have this incentive to cheat on the cartel. Wouldn't that still be the case, no matter what the machine tells you?
And I'll make a ton of money at the bar.
And I'll get a good room for the night, extra cheap.
Well, you just get a whole block of rooms at that point.
Yeah,
that's right.
Me and the whole team.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, Steve, you're hitting on the other kind of critical point is, right, this is cartel theory that we spend a lot of time thinking about. Every member of a cartel has an incentive to cheat, undercut the other members, sort of take the benefits for themselves. There's sort of an interesting application of that concept here because you don't necessarily know, when Nathan and Brent and I are getting recommendations from our pricing algorithm and then we're acting on them, we're either accepting them or not. And we're, all each of us gets to see is just what the final product was. Brent posts a hotel room for X dollars and Nathan posts his for Y dollars. We don't get to see necessarily, are they accepting the recommendation? Are they undercutting? So you kind of have this curious environment where we don't actually see if there's cheating occurring or not. And again, because we have the ability to just reject the recommendation altogether, nothing's really stopping us from cheating on the alleged cartel. So that's kind of the other thing that's not so well developed in the space yet, is kind of what's the mechanism by which the agreement holds in place. What prevents people from cheating, right? Because the other sort of element you need in a cartel is be able to observe deviation from the cartel and be able to punish the deviators. And so what that mechanism is here is not that clear, right? How does one hotel punish another hotel for deviating from a price recommendation that they don't actually get to observe being made by the algorithm?
Is the kind of the share of the market that you've got going to matter a lot too? I mean, if the three of us have our, we're using the algorithm, but the vast majority of people that are competing with us are not. Is that a concern at all? Does, sort of how successful the cartel is more widely, does that come into, is that important for analysis?
You would think so. I mean, there's one paper actually that's pretty recent, sort of talks about, and just a step back, I guess, there's not been a ton of, despite there being a ton of literature on the topic, there's not a ton in terms of how do you empirically go in there and sort of look at these issues. And so one pretty recent paper talked about, if you can observe prices increasing, the more industry participants join or adopt the algorithm. If there's sort of that relationship between more people adopt, prices go up, what the paper suggests is, well, you can start to infer maybe the algorithm is developed in a way that's sort of meant to facilitate some sort of collusive outcome. But, to your question, like, is there some bright line where, well, when 75% of the market participants have joined, we now have a successful cartel agreement? There's nothing even remotely close to a rule of thumb like that. It's, I think that's kind of the, right. We always think about what are the outside options, if there's some collusive activity that's alleged to be going on, what are the alternatives customers have? And so, if it's everybody on the strip participating versus just a subset and then a group of competitors aren't participating, presumably that would give the customers some leverage to be able to say, look, I'm not going to accept this elevated price. I'll just go to the next hotel on the strip.
Right.
And surely that becomes even more complicated if there are more than one firm that actually do the third-party type pricing. So if three hotel chains are working with one firm and another 4 hotel chains are working with a different one, and they've got different algorithmic models trying to get some form of collusion where you're not losing out to the other side of quote unquote the algorithmic collusion, is going to be really difficult.
Well, that's the other part of it, is the vendors of these algorithms are themselves in competition with each other for a product that's more valuable to the customer, right? It's not enough to say, well, you give me your data, I'll give you a recommendation for what you should charge for your product. Presumably it has to have some value in order for the customer to keep subscribing. And so, there's actually competition at that level of it as well.
Wonder what they're charging.
No, nobody knows.
It's like Inception, but with
algorithmic Inception.
Yeah. With so many prices that you're dealing with as a company, is it feasible for you to reject any individual price or any collection of prices given by the algorithm? Wouldn't you just say, I'm taking what the algorithm says and not think about it because you've paid that company to do the thinking for you? The question, I think, is
if you're like a hotel, for example, and prices are changing all the time.
If I want to be a defector, isn't it super hard for me to defect when I've got so many prices I have to set, and then I've got to give a human opinion about what the algorithm is saying?
Yeah, I think that's another big piece of this, right? So, for example, there was a DOJ recently filed a case, and what they described as part of their complaint was they did an investigation and they found as much as half of the time the recommendation was rejected. So you can sort of interpret that information in different ways, but it certainly sounds like if that's true, then that company isn't sort of putting its decision-making in the hands of the algorithm all the time. It's certainly...
I'd love to know if they were rejected because they were too low.
Yeah.
Maybe. And and that's the question, right? That's sort of like the nature of the kind of unique element of these cases is like it could be rejected because it could be too low, it could be rejected as too high. I guess we'll find out when the case proceeds. But to Brent, to your question, like if you were to accept a recommendation every single time because you just ceded decision-making authority,
you wouldn't see as many rejections no matter what.
You wouldn't think so.
There's still some discretion there. So are we doomed? Is the algorithm going to take us all over? Are all of our prices going to be set by 3 super price competitors who themselves then share their prices with other major third-party price competitors?
I hope we're not doomed. I got a lot going on.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not ready, Brent. I don't think we're doomed. Steve, do you think we're doomed?
I don't think we're doomed. I think that it's always possible when you're talking about these algorithms and machine learning where it's sort of a black box to paint a very scary picture. But I think that, like you said, people could take the advice of the algorithm or not. There's a lot of other, ways in which they can reach these decisions, and they have some expertise in this. And so I think it's just another source of information that they can use if they find it useful, but they're not bound to it.
I think as long as we've got humans overriding the good, efficient advice that the computers are giving us and making mistakes, then we are not doomed.
That's the voice of the resistance I want to hear. When Skynet comes for me, I want Nathan on my side.
Skynet comes, is like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, on that positive note, Mike, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you guys for having me.
Thanks, Mike.
Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers, Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLemara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.